One day in 1819, 3,000 miles off the coast of Chile, in one of the most remote regions of the Pacific Ocean, 20 American sailors watched their ship flood with seawater. They had been struck by a whale, which had ripped a catastrophic hole in the ship's hull. As their ship began to sink beneath the swells, the sailors huddled together in 3 small whaleboats. They were 10,000 miles from home, more than 1,000 miles from the nearest scrap of land. In their small boats, they carried only rudimentary navigational equipment and limited supplies of food and water. These were the men of the whale ship Essex, and no one on land had any idea that anything had gone wrong. No search party was coming to look for them. 24 hours had now passed since the capsizing of the ship. The time had come for the sailors to make a plan, but they had very few options. They were just about as far from land as it was possible to be anywhere on Earth. They knew that the nearest islands they could reach were the Marquesa Islands, 1,200 miles away, but they'd heard some frightening rumors. They'd been told that these islands and several others nearby were populated by cannibals. So they pictured coming ashore only to be murdered and eaten for dinner. Another possible destination was Hawaii, but given the season, the captain was afraid they'd be struck by severe storms. Now, the last option was the longest and the most difficult: to sail 1,500 miles due south in hopes of reaching a certain band of winds that could eventually push them toward the coast of South America. But they knew that the sheer length of this journey would stretch their supplies of food and water. To be eaten by cannibals, to be battered by storms, to starve to death before reaching land. These were the fears that danced in the imaginations of these poor men, and as it turned out, the fear they chose to listen to would govern whether they lived or died. After much deliberation, the sailors finally made a decision. Terrified of cannibals, they decided to forego the closest islands and instead embarked on the longer and much more difficult route to South America. After more than 2 months at sea, they ran out of food, as they knew they might, and they were still quite far from land. When the last of the survivors were finally picked up by 2 passing ships, less than half of the sailors were left alive, and some of them had resorted to their own form of cannibalism. Herman Melville, who used this story as research for his novel Moby Dick, wrote years later and from dry land, "All the sufferings of these miserable men of the Essex might in all human probability have been avoided had they, immediately after leaving the wreck, steered straight for Tahiti. But, as Melville put it, they dreaded cannibals." In other words, the men of the whale ship Essex allowed their most vivid fears to inform the crucial decision of how to proceed once disaster had struck. We all know the motivational line from President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inaugural address, the one where he convinced a nation deep in the throes of the Great Depression that the only thing to fear is fear itself. While there's certainly an amount of wisdom in this well-quoted philosophy, I'm not convinced that we as a society get it completely right. I believe that we mistake the words, "the only thing to fear is fear itself," as a call to suppress our fears. And while suppressing or simply ignoring our fears sounds nice, I don't believe that it's realistic for most of us. For our own fears, oftentimes, are the imagined outcomes of our vulnerabilities. Our own fears are the imagined outcomes of our vulnerabilities. I don't know about you, but for me, it's very difficult to admit my vulnerabilities and my fears to myself, let alone to my loved ones. By now, you know that here at Shalom during this season, we have been engaging in difficult conversations, Talking about our fears certainly fits into this category. But before we can engage in difficult conversations about our real fears with each other, we must first and foremost be honest with ourselves, asking ourselves the tough questions. What am I afraid of? How do my fears inform my choices? Which of my fears are harmful to me and which are helpful, and how do I know the difference? Rabbi Alan Lew, of blessed memory, was a man who spent the early years of his adulthood deeply immersed in Zen Buddhism before eventually pursuing the rabbinate. He was a brilliant teacher and author, and he wrote a great deal on the topic of fear from the Jewish perspective. He reminds us that while the English word fear encompasses a whole range of experiences, the Jewish tradition contains two words for the experiences of fear: norah and pachad. These words, though both often translated to mean fear, describe two very different actualities. Norah describes a kind of fear that encompasses awe and wonder. It's the sensation that we get when we realize that we are part of something greater than ourselves. In fact, this very day is the climax of the Yamim Noraim, the 10 days of wonder and awe from Rosh Hashanah to today, Yom Kippur. Norah, or a sense of wonder and awe for something greater, which some of us wish to call God, is what the ancient rabbis hoped would be invoked in each of us during this season. On the other hand, Rabbi Lew teaches that pachad is something very different from norah, the awesome fear. Pachad refers to projected or imagined fear. Rabbi Lew believes that this kind of fear is a form of suffering, which is ultimately the state of being afraid of something that we don't have to be afraid of. Pachad, then, is the fear of the phantom, the fear whose object is imagined. It is astounding how often such fears become the organizing principles of our lives and how much they close us off from the world. The fear described by pachad, the phantoms that terrify us, is so scary because it feels so real. It's almost impossible for us to separate the phantoms, what we imagine will be the outcome based on our deepest vulnerabilities, from the reality. Some of you know that I sent out a survey to the congregation asking you to anonymously share your deepest fears. I have to tell you that I was overwhelmed and humbled by your responses. I was overwhelmed by the number of you who shared your fears, and I was humbled by the content of what you shared. As I sifted through your fears, I realized that while each of your fears are very specific, they all fall into some basic archetypal categories. At the end of the day, we are afraid of violence. We are afraid of the kind of world that we might leave for our children. We are afraid of what the future holds. We ask questions: will I have enough money to support myself and my family? Will I be able to still care for myself? Will I outlive my spouse, or even worse, my children? We are afraid that our relationships will fall by the wayside. We are afraid of suffering, physical, emotional, and spiritual suffering. We fear physical and/or mental deterioration. We are afraid of disappointing our loved ones, and we are afraid of disappointing ourselves. I realized, though, as I was tallying up our fears, that more than anything else, we are afraid of death and dying. For 38 weeks now, Paul Kalanithe's memoir, When Breath Becomes Air, has been on the New York Times bestsellers list. This beautifully written book chronicles a young doctor's own journey towards his untimely death. Dr. Paul Kalanithe was a 36-year-old neurosurgeon resident and neuroscience postdoctoral fellow at Stanford in his 7th year of his program when he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. Before settling on medicine, however, Dr. Kalanithe earned degrees in English literature as well. He was fascinated with the intersection of the spirit and the mind. In his memoir, he wrote, "While all doctors treat diseases, Neurosurgeons work in the crucible of identity. Every operation on the brain is by necessity a manipulation of the substance of ourselves, and every conversation with a patient undergoing brain surgery cannot help but confront this fact. At those crucial junctures, the question is not simply whether to live or die, but what kind of life is worth living. Little did Dr. Kalanithi know that before long, he would be the patient on the other end of those questions. He described the moments after the confirmation of his diagnosis with the following words: "My life had been building potential that would now go unrealized. I had planned to do so much, and I had come so close. I was physically debilitated. My imagined future and my personal identity collapsed, and I faced the same existential quandaries that my patients faced. My carefully planned and hard-won future no longer existed. Death, so familiar to me in my work, was now paying a personal visit. Here we were, finally, face to face, and yet nothing about it seemed recognizable. Standing at the crossroads where I should have been able to see and follow the footprints of the countless patients I had treated over the years, I saw instead only a blank, harsh, vacant, gleaming white desert, as if a sandstorm had erased all trace of familiarity." Paul was terrified that the life that he had dreamed of and worked towards was over as he knew it. Now that his identity as a surgeon and a scientist on the cusp of an esteemed career was lost, he was afraid of his future, afraid of what the rest of his days might look like. Ultimately, Paul processed his fear. Over and over again, when Paul and his wife Lucy met with his oncologist, she would advise, "You have to figure out what's most important to you." In the end, Paul realized that he needed to nourish his relationship with his wife. Together, they decided that they wanted to become parents. He realized that he needed to finish his residency, and perhaps above all, he knew that he had to write a memoir. Paul used words that he had learned as an undergraduate as a mantra. "I can't go on, I'll go on." He wrote, "I would have to learn to live in a different way, seeing death as an imposing itinerant visitor, but knowing that even if I'm dying, until I actually die, I am still living." Paul found a way to process his fear, the fear of the unknown that stretched before him, and he turned it into meaning. While Dr. Paul Kalanithi's story is profound, to be sure, we need not wait until we experience a similar destiny to his to process our own fears and to examine our own lives. The ancient rabbis legislated that on this day, on Yom Kippur, we should abstain from eating and drinking, from washing ourselves, anointing ourselves, putting on shoes, and having marital relations. Furthermore, traditionally on this day, we wear a white shroud or a kittel, the same shroud in which we will be buried upon our deaths. If Rosh Hashanah then is Yom Harat Olam, the birthday of the world, Yom Kippur is the day where we rehearse for our own death, by dressing the part and by abstaining from all worldly pleasures. The rabbis of the Talmud teach that we say the vidui, the confessional prayer, on 2 days, on Yom Kippur and on the day of our deaths. Why? Because God accepts our teshuvah, our returning, and our repentance until even the last day of our lives. And for all intents and purposes, we are supposed to view Yom Kippur, we are supposed to view today as that day. Still, though, perhaps it seems harsh that our tradition throws our biggest collective fear in our faces. The truth is, it's not harsh, it's a gift. Our tradition pushes us to process our fear today, a day when, for most of us, we do not yet know the approximate number of days we have left, a day other than the day we ultimately will lay on our deathbeds. We are urged to process our deepest fears today so that we might figure out the real purpose of the days that we have left on this earth. To borrow Dr. Kalanithi's words, the question today is not simply whether to live or die, but what kind of life is worth living? How, though, do we go about processing our fears, the fears of death and dying and all of the other fears? How do we take pachad, our projected and imagined fears, though they seem very real, and turn them into norah, the fear that encompasses the awe and wonder where we are aware that we are part of something much greater than ourselves? Of course, there are many different paradigms for this process. I'd like to suggest just one from the Jewish tradition. It comes from the book of Exodus. As the Israelites stood at the shores of the Sea of Reeds, behind them they saw the Egyptian army in the distance, and in front of them the vast blue sea. The people cried out to God, asking, "Why couldn't you have left us alone to serve the Egyptians rather than to die in the desert?" Then, in quick succession, Moses tells the people, "Al tira'u, don't be afraid. Hityatzvu, collect yourselves. Uru, see in front of you. Tacharishun, hold your place, be still." Then, God tells Moses to convey to the Israelites, "V'yisa'u, go forward." We know the rest of the story. Go forward they did, and their pachad, their imagined fear, melted away as the sea parted before their very eyes. Rabbi Liu teaches that this passage can be a Jewish paradigm for processing pachad and turning it into norah. He writes, "We find ourselves in a terrible dilemma, and we are appropriately frightened. We know that something must be done, but we have no idea what, and this terrifies us. So 1, al tira'u, we stop running away from our fear. 2, hityatzvu, we collect ourselves. We stand still, we let go of our terror, and we allow the world to reconstitute itself. Then 3, uru, we see our experience for what it really is. And 4, tacharishun, we hold our place. This brings us to a point of deep stillness. Only then does the next action, the necessary action, arise out of this stillness. 5, v'yisa'u, we move forward, not really acting ourselves, but giving ourselves to the action the moment requires. Just as the Israelites processed their pachad and turned it into norah, into an awareness of the awe and wonder that is the divine, so too can each of us do the same. Imagine what might have happened had the men from the whale ship Essex took the time to process their fears, had they stopped mentally racing, collected themselves, saw the reality for what it was, and held their place. Perhaps they would have realized that the necessary action was, in fact, to sail the shortest distance to Tahiti. After all, they had no proof that the island was inhabited by cannibals. The greater danger was actually the threat of dehydration and starvation. For, as President Roosevelt said in full, "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." I'm sure he didn't know it, but the president was talking about turning pachad into norah. And so I pray, may we use what is left of this